Ray Hill grew up on a farm, and he took up rowing in college. So he's always been a hard worker, not to mention an early riser. In this edition of the Health Biz Podcast, Ray brings us up to date on his progress at CorEvitas. As CEO and chairman there, he's led the company's expansion from a singular focus on a rheumatoid arthritis registry to a broader autoimmune and inflammatory company that has registries, real-world evidence, biorepositories, and patient engagement capabilities. I was partial to the company's former name, Corrona, but for some reason, it didn't seem to have the right connotations for the pandemic era. When he's not focused on CorEvitas, Ray continues to row and to cycle. He's also chair of Row New York, which combines rowing and academics for kids who would not otherwise have access. I'm your host, David Williams, and I hope you enjoy this episode. Meanwhile, if your business needs strategy consulting support, please reach out to me at dwilliams@healthbusinessgroup.com. We have experience throughout healthcare and life sciences, including with real-world evidence companies similar to CorEvitas. Ray, it's great to speak with you today. How's it going?
Hey, great, David. Good to speak to you too, man.
Excellent. Listen, we're going to talk about some exciting news for the company, rebranding and broadening what you're doing and increasing your ambition. So that's great. But I want to wind it back and start with. I'm not a psychologist or anything, but we'll start with your childhood, your upbringing, your education. Give us a sense of who Ray was.
Yeah, I was born in '62. I grew up on a family farm, so had a pretty middle class upbringing. Excuse me. My mom was a nurse. She worked at a local hospital. My dad was an accountant, but we had a really cool life. So it was like a 10-acre farm. We had a couple of sheeps, some pigs. We had a cow and lots of vegetables, things like that. So spent a lot of my summers chopping wood, doing stuff around the farm, things like that. So that was
Now, it's meant to be like a family business or like a hobby or just like a philosophy, like a lifestyle philosophy.
it was a little bit of a lifestyle and I guess a little bit of a family business. I mean, honestly, farms don't make a ton of money, as you know. So
No.
it definitely didn't pay a lot of bills, but we had some fun.
Yeah, no, that's a good experience anyway. I know my dad grew up as like he says slave labor, like plucking chickens and stuff. That was in an earlier era, but
Well, yeah, we didn't do quite that bad.
yeah,
So I was fortunate. I don't think I could quite go that far.
yeah. All right, so then you went off to school,
Yeah.
Cornell.
Yeah. So Cornell undergraduate and then Duke for grad school. So
Nice.
I started out, I was one of these, kind of get interested in a bunch of different things. And so I went in a couple of paths in my career, but, the whole farming thing got me quite interested in animal sciences. So I actually started out in animal sciences in Cornell. And it didn't quite click for whatever reason at Cornell. So I ended up pivoting halfway and focused on natural resources. So I ended up with a degree in natural resources from Cornell, worked a few years in that field and then went back to graduate school and got a master's in environmental management from Duke in the late 80s.
Got it. Now, when you were in college, I think you were and still are a rower. Is
Yeah.
that right? What was that about?
Yeah. So I was a walk-on, I don't know, probably like a lot of kids. I got a letter from the coach, and when you're 17 years old and you get this, nice letter on letterhead from the coach, you think, wow, I'm really special. And I think he actually sent it to every kid that was, over 6 feet and over 200 pounds, and I qualified on both those dimensions. So not sure I really brought much to the party there.
I was going to say when you first said that you got you thought everybody got this letter, I was thinking I didn't get one, but I'm under 6 feet and I'm under 200, so
Yeah.
that's maybe why I didn't get it. I got some other letters, but not that one.
Yeah. Yeah, but look, it's something that has stuck with me for all of my life, and I've always sort of thought that rowing is a little bit of a metaphor for how to succeed at life. Rowers are those crazy guys that are out at 5:30 or 6 in the morning on the water, things like that. But it's this really cool combination of strength and technique that really makes rowing an interesting sport, I think.
That's good. Certainly, a lot of people, that have that background. Certainly, something you can't just sort of be lazy and just hanging around. You gotta pull your weight, so to speak.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
So now, listen, you've been at well, I was going to say you've been at Corona for a while, but that's what we used to call it. And now, you want to announce the new company name?
Drum roll, please.
Yeah.
CorEvitas.
CorEvitas,
Yeah.
excellent. So it sounds like it's a logical progression because you had Cornell, Corona, and now CorEvitas. So it all. What is Duke doesn't make sense in there, but other than that,
Makes sense. And we've had this history of buying companies that only begin with the letter H.
yeah.
We've done three
All
of them
right,
now.
good. So let's come to the new CorEvitas
Yeah.
momentarily. What's the origin of the company? Corona actually, I think, actually stood for something, right? It's
No,
like
you're 100% right. So Corona actually stood for the Consortium of Rheumatology Researchers of North America. And that really is kind of the foundation. We started in the rheumatology world. So we were founded by this fellow named Joel Kremer. And Joel has done a lot for the science of rheumatology. He was one of the guys that was the original researchers behind use of methotrexate, for example, in treatment of RA. And if you go back to the late 90s, early 2000s, you probably remember the TNFs, tumor necrosis factor drugs, were just starting to come out. I think Enbrel was launched in 98, Humira was launched in the US in 2000. And it was very clear that these drugs were, kind of a sea change in terms of treatment. They were incredibly efficacious, but at the same time, there was a lot of concern over black box warnings and, just risk with these drugs. And Joel's bright idea was, gosh, could I get a group of other clinicians, other researchers together, and could they basically help me track what outcomes we see with these drugs? And so if you go back to 2000, of course, there was no EMR. There was claims data, and claims data are called admin data for a reason, right? Not
exactly.
exactly clinically rich, right? So Joel's idea was, get a group of researchers together. They're already seeing the patient anyway, so it's not like it's a separate visit. I'll pay the docs to collect this information, but I'll only pay if the data are complete. So Joel started out with a handful of friends, essentially friends of Joel, paying them a modest amount, and the thing grew from there.
And so I understand why it would be interesting to have that information. You're trying to understand about safety and efficacy and so on. But what's the model of who pays for that? How does that work?
Yeah, so basically, all of our subscribers are pharmaceutical companies today. So we pay sites a lot of money, honestly, because we've got to compensate. It used to be friends of Joel, and today now we're in 8 registries, 7 diseases. We're well beyond kind of our roots in rheumatology. And it really is an economic value proposition now for the physician, right? So the physician makes very solid money working with Corona, and that's, the primary reason that they're involved. Also, it helps them better care for the patient by, looking at key measures that they really ought to be looking at to better understand how to care for these patients. But at the end of the day, it really is our pharmaceutical subscribers who, are paying us for the data, and in turn allows us to pay physicians.
And why is it that, I mean, it's certainly useful and interesting for the pharmaceutical companies to have this data. How do they use it? Is it for other sort of drug development, for their label, for reimbursement, competitive? What are the uses for it?
Yeah, really good question. So, what we really differentiate on is the granularity of the data we collect and the longitudinality. So, if you think about the diseases, so David, I think our business, we're mostly in autoimmune and inflammatory conditions, right? So, if you think about those diseases, there are key clinical measures that aren't routinely captured in EMR claims or other sources of data that really help to inform care. If you're in the rheumatology world, the measure you're most interested in is the CDAY score, Clinical Disease Activity Index, right? And that's a combination of a physician global, patient global, and then you do a tender and swollen joint count for 28 joints. If you're in the dermatology world, you might be thinking about the PASI score. So each of these areas where we've built these syndicated registries has these very unique clinical measures. And you go back to kind of Joel's original vision, it was to collect these RCT, he would call it, randomized controlled trial quality data in a routine clinical setting. And so gathering these measures really makes us distinct. And back to the model, because we only pay docs if the data are complete. Our data are very, very complete. 95% plus typically is what we cite. So that really makes the data very unique. And if you talk to folks in the pharmaceutical industry who purchase real world evidence, real world sources of data, those are the two factors typically that you will hear: granularity and longitudinality. And that really is what kind of characterizes the data we collect. Now, to your question, our data ends up in a pretty broad range of uses. Medical affairs and safety are the two most common. So, medical affairs, we're typically very involved in using our data to write abstracts and full-length manuscripts. We've published over 125 full-length manuscripts, and we're well over now 500 abstracts. So we have a team of about 60 PhD and master's levels biostatisticians and epidemiologists. They're folks who really work with the data. And then we're also very involved in post-approval safety commitments. So if a drug is approved and the EMA or FDA requires a post-approval safety commitment for a drug, CorEvitas is often involved in helping to collect that data. And as part of building these syndicated registries, we might be collecting X thousands of patients on a particular drug, reporting back to the pharma company about what we see from the data and things like that. So that's the basics of the model. We've extended it from there into oftentimes work in HEOR, some work in commercial and things like that, but med affairs and safety really are the historic roots of CorEvitas.
Now, these registries started off, as you say, really before the dawn of the electronic medical record era. There were
Yeah.
claims that weren't that useful, and I understand EMRs don't do everything, but does it surprise you that the registries can coexist with the EMRs, and are the EMRs in any way a threat to the registry approach?
So, it's a really interesting question, and it's something that, I looked at. I've been now at CorEvitas since 2014. It was one of the very first topics I looked at, honestly, when I came here. And, reality is that these measures are just not collected in EMRs. And you can do all the AI and NLP you'd like on a data set, an EMR data set, but if that measure does not exist, you can't recreate it. So it's not like you can read the physician note, right? If you read the physician note, it will say things like, hand and swelling is improved in the patient, that kind of thing, right? You can't create something that is not there. So, will EMRs get to the point one day where, they have 98, 99% levels of completeness for tender and swollen joint counts? Maybe. I kind of doubt it, because reality is docs are very busy. They want to get on to the next patient, things like that. So, I think for the foreseeable future, we feel like we're in a pretty good place.
You mentioned the term real world evidence, and that's another term that really wasn't in use at the time that the registries came in. The concept kind of makes sense. Maybe you can explain the concept and how what you do fits into the landscape of real world evidence, which is not just registries.
Yeah, no, totally good question. I always like to distinguish real world evidence from clinical trial data. So if you think about running a phase 3 trial, you can kind of say you're answering the exam question for the agency, right? You want to collect exactly what you need to display to the agency to prove that your drug should be approved, that you have efficacy and the requisite safety, and that there are health benefits of the drug that exceed the risk, right? So you've kind of answered the exam question. The agency says, congratulations, your drug is approved. And of course, all of a sudden, then your drug is being used in what's called the real world, right? Again, to distinguish from the clinical trial world. And patients using your drug may be less sick. One of the things we often see with clinical trials in rheumatology, as an example, is that sicker patients, things like that. So patients may be less sick. Patients may have comorbidities. Patients may be older. Patients may be younger. All sorts of differences that you see. And so really the question becomes, how are these drugs that are so expensive performing in the real world? That really is the focus. And so the term real world evidence really is just, making that bridge going from a clinical trial over to when a drug is approved and in use. Now, in terms of where we fit in that landscape, registries, syndicated registries, as CorEvitas runs them, is one of a few ways of arguably collecting data. Back to the earlier part of the discussion, the simplest way is claims, right? Claims are captured obviously for every single patient, but claims still is largely administrative data. So you get information on cost, price, things like that. I guess cost really of the drug and other salient things, but you may not really be getting the deep clinical data. Electronic medical records are, of course, a second source of data. And, they have their place in the world, certainly in terms of the data you collect, things like that. And then third, you see a bunch of maybe more specialist data sets. You see genomic data sets, you see companies like Prognos with lab data, for example, social determinants of health, one could argue about, a whole bunch of different data sets. We really focus on diseases where the clinical and safety data are paramount to understanding how well these drugs are truly performing in the real world. So for our space, rheumatology, psoriasis, psoriatic and spondyloarthritis, and axial SpA, inflammatory bowel disease, Crohn's and ulcerative colitis, multiple sclerosis, atopic dermatitis, and then the latest registry we're launching is a rare disease, neuromyelitis optica. We're relatively unique in terms of the kind of the completeness and the longitudinality of the data. So, it's arguably a messy world in the real world. That's the reality of it. You've got lots of people saying that they have regulatory grade. That's a phrase you'll see on almost every single website. But when you really start to get down and look at the depth of the data, you'll see quite a lot of differences in terms of gaps and things like that.
So, Ray, the autoimmune and inflammatory markets are pretty large in terms of number of patients, but in particular the spend on pharmaceuticals is pretty high.
Yeah.
The really big place, though, in real world evidence is oncology, which
Mm-hmm.
is even a lot bigger. Now, my impression there is that there's been a ton of investment, a ton of excitement,
Yeah.
and a lot of infrastructure built up, and yet I'm not sure those companies are making money. I don't know how much of an impact they're really having. Is that fair in oncology, and is it the same on the autoimmune side?
I think, look, if you look at oncology, several companies have made really pretty dramatic progress over the last 5 years. I mean, obviously, Flatiron would probably be the first company you
Yep.
think from, when they bought their EMR in 2014, and they've done a tremendous amount of work around curating the data using nurse practitioners to essentially interpret the note, things like that. I think honestly, look, real progress has been made there. There's been tremendous progress on the genomic side. You just can't debate that, right? Precision medicine has a solid 10 years now of experience really in the oncology world. And that's a bit different from autoimmune, honestly. Certainly precision medicine has not quite come to the autoimmune world. We've focused on autoimmune and inflammatory diseases largely because, David, the market is very big. There's a number of different diseases. As we look at our model, certainly our model can apply in other areas. It can apply in oncology. It can apply in a number of other diseases, but we've really kind of tried to stick to the knitting where we know we can do really well and we can be, we think, competitively advantaged.
So now you changed the company's name, and I'm scratching my head over that because what's wrong with the name Corona? It's a well-known word.
It actually is a wonderful name, and we really like Corona. But two things. Number one, we're one R away from the coronavirus, so that was obviously a bit of a challenge for us. And of course, no one really could have predicted the extent and scale of the pandemic. And in the early days of last year, January, February, I think we all were sort of hoping that this would go away. And of course, it hasn't gone away, nor is it going to go away. So that became a dominant theme for us. And we collect data now from almost 500 sites across the United States, Canada, and Japan. And, reality is, our investigators are hearing about this every day, where patients, might get a little confused because of our name. So that was one. The second, and really, ultimately the primary driver for changing our name to CorEvitas was really reflecting the growth of the company. We're pretty different from our original roots in rheumatology. We don't want to forget about those roots. Those are really, really pretty important to us. But we're now in 8 different diseases. So we've got a much broader footprint. We've done 3 acquisitions, which we probably ought to talk about sometime here. So
Yep.
we're just in a very different place, honestly. And we changed the name at this point really to reflect, kind of the growth of the company and where we see going. And just to kind of build on the name a little bit, we picked Core, obviously, because of the link to Corona. We didn't want to sort of forget about that. Core also indicates that something is central, right? So we do believe we play a central role. It's got a little bit of a linkage to the sun with the Corona, right? And then Evitas, has some linkage to evidence, which is ultimately what we provide. So that's really why we pick CorEvitas. it was a pretty interesting exercise for us. I never realized how hard it is to rebrand a company.
Yeah.
And you start to look at all these names, and obviously you have to look beyond just, hey, is it available in the US? You have to look at the EU, you have to look at Japan. So we went through a lot of different candidates before landing here, but we're really pretty happy about where we landed.
Well, I like the name. It's funny when these things it's not funny, but it's can be impactful when some name takes on some other meaning. I know that, for example, there used to be something called the AIDS diet candy, and if you
Hmm.
look at the old advertisements, you can see on YouTube it says, I lost weight with the aid of AIDS.
Yeah.
And you don't want that. I think there were a few companies that sounded like ISIS as well. So those were
Well, ICE
those.
Pharmaceuticals is
Yeah,
one example. You're 100.
those were a problem. Now, I like the new name, CorEvitas. The other thing that it evokes for me is Veritas.
Yeah.
So not the company Veritas, but
Yes.
the Latin
Yeah.
for
We
that.
talked about that linkage as well. Yes.
Yeah, so that's good. All right, so I understand why you have a new name, and presumably there's not going to be. I would be pretty surprised if there's a CorEvitas pandemic. That would be pretty
I
unlucky.
would hope to goodness that you're correct there.
That would be tough if lightning struck twice in that
Yeah, I would really not be happy.
in that way. So, all right. So you mentioned a couple recent
Yeah.
acquisitions, which I find quite interesting, especially because obviously there's some things that are kind of clear, but then patient experience and patient engagement. How does that fit in?
Yeah, so we started. Maybe I'll take you back a little bit before and get to patient experience, David, if it's all right. But we started back in March of 2019 when Health IQ joined the CorEvitas family. We acquired Health IQ, and we really did that for a couple reasons. Number one, it broadened our footprint outside of the United States and Japan. They're based in London. Number two, they have access to a broad range of NHS data sets and you probably know, very, very high quality data in general over there that the NHS data sets are part of. In particular, they have census data on 304,000 oncology patients. So that is really very valuable. And then third, we found the team was really excellent at productizing insights. So they've been very, very smart about looking at these data sets and kind of building software as a service products off of those data sets. So Health IQ was really our first move. And then to your point, patient experience, we really saw as a logical complement to the registry business and what we're building at CorEvitas. And the reason I say that is because pharmaceutical companies are clearly very invested today in the role of the patient. The role of the patient is central in clinical trials. Yet at the same time, I think a lot of pharmaceutical companies realize that they can't just pay lip service to that. They really need to think about, hey, what does that exactly mean, and how do I design a clinical trial to make it friendly to the patient? And that's kind of easier said than done. And so I had met Abby Steele, the CEO of Healthy Vibe, probably 4 or 5 years ago, actually, and we really liked her business, but it was pretty small, and she did a great job really growing that business. So we ended up acquiring Healthy Vibe in December of 19. And then the third piece of the puzzle that we put together is in October of last year, we acquired Health Unlocked. And Health Unlocked, we put together with Healthy Vibe. That's why I joke that we can't get out of the H's in our
Yeah, no kidding.
So maybe we'll move on soon. But
Watch out, Honeywell, huh?
yeah, no, I think that might be out of our league. That's probably a strategic diversification the board
I
can't
would guess. Yeah.
But Health Unlocked is really pretty fascinating. So they built the world's largest online patient community. So that's a community of 1.4 million members, highly engaged, providing data about their experience with the disease. And so that really gives us this whole continuum from the deep, very robust registry data over to, gee, if you'd like to study 300 patients that are taking Janssen's medication, for COVID-19 or something like that, we could study 300 patients. If you want to study 400 lupus patients to understand their experience, we could study 400 lupus patients. So it really adds, a very nice piece, we think, strategically to the puzzle. And so essentially what we built out is we built out really, or building out 4 different business units. The registry business unit, right, where we have our 8 registries and 7 diseases. The patient experience business unit, which Healthy Vibe and Health Unlock contribute to, a play around EMR and claims and specialty data sets, which Health IQ is part of. And then the fourth piece of the puzzle that we're building is biosamples. We had historically done quite a bit of work in the RA space, and we're now expanding that into other diseases. And back to the whole precision medicine discussion and autoimmune, you can argue about when and how quickly, but our view is increasingly that over the next 3, 5, 7 years, we think that precision medicine will be coming to the autoimmune diseases, and we think biorepository combined with our very deep and rich clinical data can be a really interesting play.
So usually think about the pharmaceutical business as being fairly global.
Yeah.
And yet there's differences though on kind of the data availability and so on that have made the registry business largely a U.S. business
Mhm.
up until this point. What's your view though? It sounds like you're in Japan, and I know there's been some you made acquisition in the UK, which used to be considered part of Europe in one way or the other. But
Yeah.
what's the international expectations there?
Yeah, so I mean, look, we're looking at it. What we've seen is there's a tremendous amount of growth right here in the United States, candidly, right? So we've got a lot of opportunity here in the US that we'd like to capitalize on. We actually have, beyond the registry already, a pretty global footprint. The patient experience business works in about 60 countries around the globe. So they do a tremendous amount of work in the EU. They do a lot of work in China, places like that. So we've got a reasonably global footprint. But I think for each of these diseases, we're really looking at the local market dynamics, where the data can be collected, and really what's kind of most valuable to build this fabric of real world evidence that we're working on.
Now, outside of the company, since it sounds like that only keeps you about 50% occupied, now that you don't have to deal with that branding thing anymore, you should have a lot of time freed up. So I know you're still into rowing, cycling. What are you working on there? Not just for yourself, but I know there's an organization, Row New York, that you're heavily involved with as
Yeah,
well.
yeah. I still row a lot. I row in my single, which I enjoy, and there weren't many benefits to the pandemic, but I must
Yeah.
admit, one benefit to the pandemic is, generally speaking, Zoom calls didn't start till 9 a.m. So 6 o'clock, I could be out on the water racing with my friends. That was actually really kind of cool. So I still do a whole lot of that. And then I've been very involved in, yeah, you mentioned Row New York, which is a not-for-profit, obviously based in New York City. And that's a very interesting organization where they combine rowing with academics for disadvantaged kids, with the end game being get them to graduate from high school and ultimately get them a college degree. So about half of the kids that we serve are first-generation Americans. Roughly 80% are students of color. 100% of our kids graduate high school, which is dramatically higher than New York City, and about 90% get a 4-year degree in college. And we find, rowing is honestly a sport about discipline, and we find that whole discipline of rowing really translates over to the academic side. And even starting with a basic thing like passing a swim test. I mean, the kid might fail 2 or 3 times, but he or she eventually passes, and it just gives them a little bit of courage. Then they get in the boat. They learn all of a sudden, hey, I can actually move this 8 with 7 other people, and it's kind of all working together. And then they think, wow, gee, maybe I can do a little bit better in school. So it's a very high dosage program. We give kids about 1,000 hours of rowing and academic instruction a year. So it's kind of like a half-time job almost, you can think about. And really, if somebody's going to be in the program, they've obviously got to build a little bit of discipline, right? You can't blow off practices and forget about your teammates. So that's been a big focus of mine. We're actually halfway through building a new boathouse on the Harlem River in New York City.
Great.
And that's also a really cool thing, I think. So, it's interesting. Rowing used to be, the center of a lot of life in New York City back in the 1800s, and that kind of all disappeared. But rowing actually had its start not in Philadelphia, not in Boston, but in New York City. And this will be the first new boathouse in probably 100 years in New York City. It'll be the first purpose-built boathouse to serve kids that wouldn't otherwise have access to rowing in the country. So the boathouse is designed by pro bono by Ward Norman Foster, a very well regarded architect. And anyway, we're hoping to break ground either later this year or early next.
That sounds great. Yes, I'm in Boston. Maybe we didn't invent here, but we have a heck of a lot of boathouses around
Yeah,
along the river. So
yeah, and you have community rowing. I'm actually a member
yeah,
up there whenever I'm up. We're headquartered in Waltham, Mass. So whenever
right.
I try to row there, but it's a little bit of a similar model where they do serve kids in the community and things like that. But unfortunately, there's a lot of kids that really need help in New York City, and we try to do our part, giving them a little bit of help.
So that's out in the water, and then on land, you're up on two wheels when you have a chance.
Yeah, I like to, I'm one of these endurance sports guys. I love competing, to be honest with you. It's just part of who I am. So I do cycle a lot. I do a bunch of, races, cycling. You go back 10 years almost, 2011, I cycled across the United States with my two sons. We raised money for a charity, Water Aid, and that was really that was an amazing experience. It's one of these things I honestly didn't know if I could do it, and
Yeah,
it was just a great experience. Met a ton of people, and it's so interesting to you fly across the U.S. I mean, how many times have we each probably
yeah.
dozens at least, right? 50.
Not recently, but yes.
Yeah, not recently, but it's just such a different experience to be going down a road. You're hearing the birds in the background and stuff like that. So it was just really really cool on a ton of different dimensions. So yeah, my fiance and I cycle quite a bit. We did the Gap Trail last summer in that's kind of like Pennsylvania, Maryland, but it's
Right.
a beautiful 150-mile old railroad bed. So we get a lot of enjoyment out of that.
That sounds good. And any time for reading? Any books to recommend these days?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I usually have one or two things, cooking on the book side. So a couple things recently. I've just finishing one. I heard about it on NPR actually. It's called First Principles by Thomas Ricks. I don't know if you've run across that.
I don't know that one. I'm learning more and more from my guests though, but I'll check
All
that one
right.
out.
It's quite interesting. So, he really was on the path of, what did our founding fathers learn from the Greeks and the Romans? And he actually wrote this book after the 2016 election happened. And he's like, wow, could the founding fathers have really, truly envisaged something like that? So it really digs into, Washington, Jefferson, Adams, and Madison, and really looks at, as I say, the Greek and Roman influences. And a lot of it is about the role of virtue, and if you go back to Washington's past, it's very interesting because he wasn't a very educated man, honestly, right? I mean, he didn't go to college, things like that. He was mostly self-taught. He didn't speak Latin, which was a sign of education, of course, at that time. But he was a foremost example, really, of the role of virtue in government, and so that was really a pretty cool read. He makes a lot of suggestions about some of the challenges we face today. He talks about campaign finance reform, kind of addressing some of the checks and balances and challenges we have there, and the outsized power of the presidency. So that was a pretty good one. And then another one I read was a book on Mozart, which I'm not a big classical music opera person, but it really was a fascinating read to learn just about something that I knew almost nothing about. And that was really very interesting to, kind of learn about the, kind of what was the message behind the music, and then listen, to a few pieces, and get kind of a little deeper there.
No, that sounds pretty good, like a pretty rich and full life. And I guess it'll be a drag once you have to get back on the road, flying around and all that. But you'll still hopefully have some time for the boat and the bike, if not
Yeah,
the book.
hopefully so. Hopefully.
Yeah. So now I know I got to go out and invest in all these H companies since they're right in your pathway to be hoovered up, so to speak. So
Exactly.
good. Well, listen, Ray Hill, Chairman and CEO of CorEvitas, formerly known as Corona. Thank you so much for your time today on the Health Biz Podcast.
Great. Thanks, David. Take care. It's been a ton of fun.
You've been listening to the Health Biz Podcast with me, David Williams, President of Health Business Group. I conduct in-depth interviews with leaders in healthcare business and policy. If you like what you hear, go ahead and subscribe on your favorite service. While you're at it, go ahead and subscribe on your second and third favorite services as well. There's more good stuff to come, and you won't want to miss an episode. If your organization is seeking strategy consulting services in healthcare, check out our website, healthbusinessgroup.com.